You are walking through a crowded market. You owe a debt. If you don't pay, can your creditor take your child as a slave? Probably not. But 4,000 years ago, the answer depended entirely on where you stood. If you were rich, you paid silver. If you were poor, you lost your freedom. The rules were not fair, but at least they were written down. In 1901, French archaeologists digging in modern-day Iran found a 7-foot-tall black stone. On it were carved 282 laws. This was the Code of Hammurabi. It didn't invent justice, but it invented the idea that the king, not the tribe, decides what justice is. And that idea kept an empire alive for 300 years. Then, in a single season, it all disappeared. This is the story of the Old Babylonian Empire, the First Babylon, the lawgiver who nearly ruled the world, and the salt that poisoned his fields. To understand the Old Babylonian Empire, you have to forget almost everything you know about countries. In 2000 BCE, there was no Iraq. There was no nation-state. Instead, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, a region the Greeks would later call Mesopotamia, was a patchwork of independent city-states. Each city had its own walls, its own god, its own king, and its own army. The most powerful of these cities included Ur, which had a massive ziggurat that still stands today. There was Isin, there was Larsa, there was Eshnunna. And far to the north, on the banks of the Euphrates, was a minor trading post called Babylon. For centuries, Babylon was nobody. The great powers of the south, the heirs of the Sumerians and the Akkadians, looked down on it as a backwater. The people who ruled Babylon were not native Sumerians. They were a Semitic-speaking people called the Amorites. The Amorites had migrated from the Syrian desert, and the settled city dwellers of the south viewed them as uncivilized outsiders. But the Amorites had one advantage: they were hungry. Around 1894 BCE, an Amorite chieftain named Samsu-iluna seized control of Babylon. He did not conquer a vast territory. He simply took one small town and declared himself king. This is the traditional founding date of the Old Babylonian Empire. But it was not an empire yet, not even close. It was just one muddy village among many. For the next 70 years, Babylon's early kings, Sumulael, Sabium, Apil-Sin, ruled quietly. They built walls. They dug irrigation canals. They paid tribute to stronger neighbors to avoid being crushed. This was the first component of empire, the slow, patient build-up of infrastructure. In 1792 BCE, a young man took the throne of Babylon. His name was Hammurabi. He was the 6th king of the First Dynasty. He was likely in his late 20s or early 30s, and he inherited a kingdom that was still a minor power. To the south, King Rimsin of Larsa controlled the rich agricultural lands of Sumer. To the north, King Shamshi-Adad I of the Upper Mesopotamian Kingdom ruled a vast territory from his capital at Shubat-Enlil. To the east, the kingdom of Eshnunna controlled the vital trade routes to Iran. Babylon was surrounded by sharks. Hammurabi did what all weak kings do. He waited. For the first 30 years of his reign, Hammurabi fought almost no major wars. Instead, he launched public works projects. He restored temples. He dug a canal named Hammurabi's Wealth to bring water to the city. He built a massive new city wall called the Bank Which Repels the Enemy. A clay tablet from this period, now held in the British Museum, records that Hammurabi also reformed the tax system. He established a standard for weights and measures. He created a standing army paid by the palace, not by local lords. This was the infrastructure of control taking shape. But Hammurabi's greatest weapon was not his army. It was his archive. Archaeologists have recovered thousands of clay letters from the royal palace of Mari, a kingdom to Babylon's northwest. These letters reveal Hammurabi as a master diplomat. He wrote constantly to his allies. He promised grain, he offered troops, and then, when the timing was perfect, he broke those promises. In his 29th year as king, Hammurabi made his first major move. He allied with Mari against Eshnunna. Together they defeated the eastern power. Then he turned south. In his 30th year, with Eshnunna weakened, Hammurabi marched on Larsa. The siege lasted 6 months, but in the end he captured King Rimsin, who was by then an old man. The letters from Mari describe Hammurabi's soldiers wading through canals to break the city's water supply. It was brutal, effective, and total. By 1755 BCE, Hammurabi had unified all of Mesopotamia. He controlled over 400,000 square kilometers, roughly the size of modern Germany. His empire stretched from the Mediterranean coast in the west to the Zagros Mountains in the east. But land alone does not make an empire. What makes an empire is how you rule it. Before Hammurabi, when a king conquered a city, he often left the local ruler in place. That local ruler paid tribute but stayed independent. Hammurabi did something different. He removed the local kings entirely. He appointed his own governors, men he called Shakanakus, who reported directly to Babylon. He stationed troops in every major city to enforce his will. He standardized the calendar and the system of weights. He imposed a labor tax called ilkum, forcing every free citizen to provide work on royal projects for a certain number of days per year. This was asymmetrical power. The center, Babylon, had all the authority. The periphery, the conquered cities, had no sovereignty. They existed to serve the capital. Clay tablets from the city of Sippar show exactly how this worked. Governors sent daily reports to Babylon on grain stores, river levels, and criminal cases. If a governor failed to meet his tax quota, he was removed. If a city rebelled, Hammurabi tore down its walls. He did this to Eshnunna. He did this to Malgium. He did this to a city called Mashkan Shapir, which was so completely destroyed that archaeologists are still excavating it today. The motivation for this expansion was straightforward. Hammurabi needed resources. He needed silver to pay his soldiers. He needed grain to feed his capital. He needed timber and stone from the mountains, which Babylon lacked. The empire was an extraction machine, and at the center of that machine was a black stone carved with 282 laws. The Code of Hammurabi is not the oldest law code in history. That title likely belongs to the Code of Ur-Nammu from the 21st century BCE. But the Code of Hammurabi is the most complete. It was carved onto a 7-foot-tall black diorite stele, a stone so hard that the original text is still legible today. At the top of the stele, an image shows Hammurabi standing before Shamash, the god of justice. Shamash is seated on a throne, wearing a horned crown and extending a rod and a ring, the symbols of authority. Hammurabi is receiving the law from a god. This is not legislation, this is divine command. The laws themselves are specific. They are case-based. They begin with the phrase, "if a man," and then list the punishment. For example, if a man puts out the eye of another man, they shall put out his eye. This is the famous lex talionis, the law of retaliation, dias. But the code was not equal. It distinguished between 3 social classes: the awilum, or free aristocrat, the mushkanum, a kind of semi-free dependent, and the wardum, or slave. The punishment for harming an awilum was severe. The punishment for harming a slave was a fine. Vati. Here is a specific law. Law number 117 states, if a man incurs a debt and sells his wife, his son, or his daughter for money, or gives them away to forced labor, They shall work for 3 years. In the 4th year, they shall be set free. This sounds progressive. Limiting debt slavery to 3 years was a real protection. But the same law does not apply to the man himself. He could not be sold into slavery for his own debt. The code protected the head of the household at the expense of his family. Another law, number 196, is the famous eye for an eye, but it only applies between equals. If a man put out the eye of another man, his eye was put out. But if a man put out the eye of a slave, he simply paid the slave's owner half the slave's value. Justice was vertical, not horizontal. This was cultural dominance. The code imposed the values of the Babylonian elite on every conquered people. You did not worship your local god the same way. You did not settle disputes the same way. You obeyed the law of the king of Babylon. And if you tried to erase the law, Hammurabi ordered that in the stele's epilogue, your fate would be eternal damnation at the hands of the gods. The peak of the Old Babylonian Empire occurred during the reign of Hammurabi and his son Samsu-iluna. By 1750 BCE, Babylon was the largest city in the world. Population estimates vary, but most scholars agree that Babylon held between 60,000 and 80,000 people. This was unprecedented for the Bronze Age. The city was surrounded by double walls. The inner wall was so thick that the Greek historian Herodotus would later claim, 500 years after the city fell, that 2 chariots could race side by side along the top. The outer wall was a moat-fed defensive barrier. Inside the city stood the great temple of Marduk, Babylon's patron god. Hammurabi had elevated Marduk from a local deity to the king of the gods. This was a political act. By promoting Marduk, Hammurabi demoted the old Sumerian gods of the south. Every conquered city, from Uruk to Nippur, had to accept that Marduk ruled the heavens just as Hammurabi ruled the earth. This is cultural dominance. Trade flourished. Babylonian merchants traveled to Anatolia to buy silver, to Cyprus to buy copper, to the Indus Valley to buy carnelian. Clay tablets from the city of Mari record shipments of tin and textiles traveling through Babylon's territory. The Akkadian language became the diplomatic standard. If a Hittite king wrote to an Egyptian pharaoh, the letter was written in Akkadian. The old Sumerian language survived only in religious texts, spoken by priests but understood by almost no one else. Babylon had become the center of the known world. Mathematics reached new heights. Babylonian scribes developed a base 60 number system that survives in our measurement of time. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour. They could solve quadratic equations. They predicted the movements of the planets. A clay tablet from this period, now held at Yale University, contains the earliest known record of a Pythagorean triple, 1,000 years before Pythagoras was born. This was the Golden Age. But even at its peak, the empire was dying. The problem was invisible, it was in the dirt. For 6,000 years, farmers in Mesopotamia had used irrigation to grow wheat and barley. They dug canals from the Tigris and Euphrates to flood their fields. The water soaked into the soil, the crops drank, and the sun evaporated the remaining water. But river water contains dissolved salts. When the water evaporates, the salt stays behind. Over centuries, salt builds up in the soil. Wheat, the most valuable grain, dies when soil salinity reaches a certain level. Barley can tolerate more salt, but even barley fails when the salt concentration gets too high. We have the receipts, literally. Clay tablets from the city of Lagash, which was under Babylonian control, record wheat yields. In the 24th century BCE, under the Akkadian Empire, farmers harvested an average of 30 bushels of wheat per acre. By the 18th century BCE, under Hammurabi's successors, that same land produced only 12 bushels per acre, a drop of 60%. Archaeologists from Cornell University and the University of Chicago have analyzed ancient soil samples. Their conclusion is brutal. The southern farmlands of Babylon were turning white with salt. The agricultural base of the empire was collapsing. Hammurabi's son, Samsu-iluna, tried to fix this. He dug new canals. He ordered farmers to grow barley instead of wheat. But the problem was too big. In the south of Mesopotamia, the old Sumerian cities were starving. They rebelled. Samsu-iluna marched south and crushed the rebellion, but the cost was enormous. He had to pay his army, but the taxes were shrinking. The periphery was pulling away from the center. The vertical line of control was fraying. Historians debate the exact timeline of this decline. Some point to climate data showing a regional drought around 1600 BCE. Others emphasize the salinization problem as the primary cause. But almost all agree on this. By 1650 BCE, the Old Babylonian Empire had lost control of its southern provinces. The Empire of Hammurabi was now just the core territory around Babylon. It was a wounded animal. The final blow came from a direction the Babylonians did not expect. From the northwest came the Hittites. The Hittites were an Indo-European people who had built a powerful kingdom in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. They had two advantages over Babylon. First, they were organized. The Hittite king Masili. I had a professional army of heavy infantry and chariots. Second, they had iron. This is debated, but most historians agree that the Hittites were among the first cultures to smelt iron on a significant scale. Iron weapons were stronger than bronze, and Babylon's army was still fighting with bronze. In 1595 BCE, Masili marched his army over 800 kilometers, through the mountains and down the Euphrates River. The walls of Babylon, once the pride of the empire, had been neglected for decades. The treasury was empty, the army was underpaid and demoralized. Masili's soldiers breached the walls, they sacked the city, they looted the temples, and then they did the unthinkable. They stole the statue of Marduk. For the Babylonians, a god without a statue was a god without a home. Marduk had left the city. The spiritual center of the empire was gone. The Hittites did not stay to rule. They collected their plunder and marched home. But their invasion had destroyed the political structure. Babylonian records from the following years are a mess. The old system of governors and taxes vanished. Into the vacuum came the Kassites. The Kassites were a people from the Zagros Mountains. They had been pressing Babylon's eastern borders for generations. After the Hittites left, the Kassites simply moved in. They did not destroy Babylon. They adopted its culture, its language, and its gods. But they were not Babylonians. They were a new dynasty. The Old Babylonian Empire was dead. The Kassites would rule for over 400 years, but that is a different story. So what made the Old Babylonian Empire great? It was not the size of its army, it was the invention of legal bureaucracy. Hammurabi created a system in which authority flowed from a single center, written in stone, enforced by governors, and justified by a state god. Every empire that followed, from the Assyrians to the Romans to the British, used the same blueprint. Conquer, standardize, write it down. And what caused its decline? The same thing that kills every empire eventually. The land gave out. The salt poisoned the grain. And when the people could not eat, they could not pay. And when they could not pay, the army could not fight. The Old Babylonian Empire lasted 300 years. It controlled the richest farmland in the ancient world. It gave us the rule of law. It gave us the 60-minute hour. And then it collapsed because of salt and iron. Today, the stele of Hammurabi stands in the Louvre Museum in Paris. Millions of tourists walk past it every year. Most see only a black rock covered in strange writing. But if you look closely, you can see the ghosts of the farmers who starved. You can see the terror of the soldiers who fought with bronze against iron. You can see the birth of empire and the seed of its death. The lawgiver carved his code to last forever. He forgot to check the soil. Babylon is gone, but the code remains, and so does the warning.